Hi, I'm going to speak very quickly. So I wanted to kind of bring in the different thoughts and ideas, because what you've heard here, we're all in agreement, I think, on this panel, which is probably why we're on the panel. But the idea here is to talk about for and with people and patients, and you've heard a lot of those things, and I'm not going to go into details, but Marjorie brought up the low literacy levels. The point I wanted to make is it doesn't matter how many initials are behind a person's name. When they are diagnosed with a cancer, or their loved one is, as the shock, it's actually a biological fact, a physiological fact, and your body is trying to protect you. And so there's actually an article that came out this week or last week about how doctors don't make better patients. And it actually says people who actually know what's going on and don't use that information when they themselves or their loved ones get sick. So actually, it's quite a good article to read. You mentioned the misdiagnosis. That's one of the things. This is kind of a typical clinic, and it could be anywhere. There are confusing terms and discussions, as we've heard about. There can be misdiagnosis, and that can happen for years. A lot of people can be diagnosed with one thing, they get treated for that thing, and then, oops, that's not actually what's wrong with you. Let's see what else there might be. And so you go through a laundry list sometimes, and it can take years, and that is an issue. There are all kinds of costs. Money is one of those, but not the only one. We've heard about family, culture, work environments. If you are a caregiver for other people in your family or loved ones, and you get cancer, that causes all sorts of problems throughout the entire social system that you have. The focus in the it's funny when I heard Marjorie talk, actually, and Elmer as well. You know, my grandparents could have been any of the cultures you were talking about, because that's how they were. That's how they were treated. That's how they thought about health and family and community. And yet our medical system has changed tremendously and doesn't treat people that way. And one of the things that's happening nowadays that I think is important, especially for those of you that are researchers in the audience, is that people are feeling more like data repositories all the time rather than people. And it's always, and now we've got AI, we've got this app, and you can do this with your watch. And everybody's thinking, okay, I wonder what's in this for me, and what I call WIFIP, what's in it for patients, because it's just one more way to take more information from them, but what do they get back? When we talk about clinical trials, there's a whole lot of stuff listed there. Sorry. Clinical trials, for those of you that may not actually know this or register it, actually cost people money a lot of times. And that's even when they have insurance. There are payments that they have to make if their insurance won't pay. There are co-pays for many of the procedures that come through. And so there are a lot of issues there besides the cost of the drugs. And then what everybody always wants to know is what's next? What happens if my cancer comes back? What's going to happen to me? Am I going to be precluded from some type of treatment that could be useful to me because I've been in this treatment or this clinical trial? People want to know that they are people. They want to know, as you can see here, when we talk about clinical trials individually, that we unfortunately still use a word that should not be used around people at all, because while the system treats it as a noun, people hear it as a verb. And I don't think that anybody in this room wants to be subjected to anything. What people really want to know are these points, and these points have been made already. My point here is, while all of these things are important, it's a lot more than just informed consent. It's actually the conversation that should take place no matter what's happening, whether or not they're talking about a clinical trial, whether or not you're talking about medical care. This is just an example of a committee that I co-chaired in what used to be CALGB, which is now a part of the Alliance for Clinical Trials in Oncology. This committee doesn't exist anymore, but these functions still do. And you see here that we covered everything that was a part of the clinical trial process. It was a very pragmatic committee where we looked at what are the issues that are holding us back from being able to do clinical trials effectively. And then we actually did little pilots, ran little pilots, and had education for the members. And if you see up there, you've got the clinical trial process, right? You've got development and approval and activation and recruitment, and then, what is that word? And then results. Well, because to patients, retention or adherence or compliance is really an endurance test. And it's an endurance test whether or not you're in a clinical trial. If you're just in regular treatment, it's a very normal, in the thousands of patients that I've worked with through the years, it's very normal halfway through treatment to say, okay, you know what? I think we're done. I think I just don't need any more. You know, I've gone through enough of this, and things should be okay. So if you look at it as endurance rather than retention or adherence, it gives a whole different feel to it, doesn't it? So what people really need is clear communication of whatever content we're giving them in the context that fits their needs, not ours, okay? And that doesn't matter what role they play. I couldn't sleep last night, and I kept thinking, what are we going to do? So I'm a big believer in action. And while a report is a certain type of an action, I'm hoping that the National Cancer Policy Forum and the Roundtable on Health Literacy will take this into further steps. So as I was contemplating this last night in my insomnia state, I thought, okay, here's actually a very important first step. And that is if we could at least recommend, if not develop, a series of health literate decision-making tools and templates that could be used by clinical practices with their patients. And these could be for care, they could also be for clinical trials. And by doing that, then you have to enlist a whole strategy, planning strategy on what could be done with that. Well, the National NCI Clinical Trial Network, NCTN, could actually run studies with that, with something that's called design thinking methodology, which came from Stanford in the software computer field. But it's an iterative process where you study something, you test it, you adjust it, you study it. So it's a loop. And I think that that is actually the kind of process and approach that we need to be taking. And as you can see there, it could be by stage, by different cancer type, it could be by population, by culture, or all of those various things. As we've heard, one person is one person and one culture is one culture. There are things that we can share between them. And then, of course, we need to publish results because we're talking about research with the research community. And those results could then be shared with all of the alphabet soup organizations that are listed up there, and guidelines that could be produced. We need to get endorsement from payers and regulators and have them a part of the whole thing, as well as credentialing agencies. I mean, these are all things that could be built into a game plan of what we could do here. So this is just one piece of it. And then once we get that kind of a plan done, we can spread it throughout North America and the world. And you know, the blue banner was supposed to come up separately, but obviously I didn't have too many hours left. And all of this needs to be done with patient communities because that's who we're actually trying to target with this. So I'm going to finish with one statement here, and I'm going to make a point. So I need you guys to see if you were paying attention, to answer to me which is correct, A or B. B. Okay, thank you. The problem is, and the reason that I'm saying this, is because there is a mindset in medicine and science that continually blames the patient for their own disease and for everything that happens to them. And that is actually inaccurate. Unfortunately, the system fails people every day, and we need to fix that. And I think that this group has a real role to play in that, so thank you.